Some things don't call for help. They just wait for someone loyal enough to notice. For 17 days straight, Rex returned to the same patch of ground behind the cabin, a quiet clearing just beyond the tree line where the forest opened like a held breath, and every morning, without fail, he would walk past the old fence post, past the fallen pine, and sit beside a moss-covered stone as if it mattered more than food, more than rest, more than anything else in the world. And at first, Daniel Hayes paid it no mind because dogs had their habits, their rhythms, their strange attachments to scents and shadows that men didn't always understand. And Rex had always been different, even back when they were both still in uniform, trained to listen for things buried beneath noise and chaos, trained to trust instincts that didn't come with explanations. But this was something else, something quieter, something that stretched longer than a passing curiosity. And on the third day, Daniel called him back with a low whistle, expecting the usual quick turn of ears and the steady trot home. But Rex didn't move, not even a flick of his tail, just sat there with his ears slightly forward, eyes fixed on the earth as if he were listening to something too distant for human hearing. And Daniel felt a small shift inside him, the kind he had learned not to ignore, but often did anyway, because noticing too much had once cost him more than he was willing to lose again. So he let it go, told himself it was nothing, that the cold October air carried strange scents through the woods, that the ground held the memory of animals passing through, that not everything needed to mean something. But on the seventh day, the weather turned and a thin layer of frost settled over the clearing, glazing the grass in a pale shimmer that caught the morning light. And still Rex went back, sat in the same spot, unmoving, as if time itself had slowed around him. And when Daniel walked out to retrieve him, boots crunching softly against the frozen ground, he noticed the way Rex's posture had changed, not tense, not afraid, but alert in a deeper way, like a soldier standing watch long after the battle had ended. And Daniel crouched beside him, resting a gloved hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath thick fur. And for a moment, he followed the dog's gaze down to the earth, expecting to see disturbed soil, a burrow, some sign of life beneath the surface. But there was nothing, just a stone half sunken into the ground, its surface worn smooth by time and weather, edges softened by moss that clung like memory. And yet something about it felt held, as if the ground beneath it carried weight that hadn't shifted in years. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath turning white in the cold air, and shook his head. "Come on, boy," he murmured, voice low and even. But Rex didn't move, not until Daniel gently tugged at his collar. And even then, the dog hesitated, glancing back once, twice, as if leaving meant abandoning something unfinished. And that night, long after the fire had settled into glowing embers and the cabin creaked softly under the weight of the cooling air, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that always came too easily out here, a silence that had no edges, no distractions, just space enough for thoughts he preferred to keep buried. And somewhere in that stillness, a memory stirred, faint but persistent, the echo of a rhythm he couldn't quite place, something like a pattern, steady and deliberate. And he turned onto his side, closing his eyes, telling himself it was just the wind slipping through the trees, just the cabin settling into the night, just another sound in a world that no longer made sense to him the way it used to. But outside, beyond the walls and the warmth and the fragile comfort of routine, the forest held its breath. And in that quiet clearing, beneath the moss-covered stone, something waited, patient as time, unchanged by seasons, and somehow, impossibly, it had already been heard. By the next morning, the cold had settled deeper into the valley, the kind that crept into wood and bone alike, turning every sound sharper, every breath visible. And Daniel found Rex already at the door before the sun had fully risen, sitting upright, alert in a way that felt less like routine and more like purpose. And without a word, Daniel pulled on his jacket, grabbed his gloves, and followed him out into the pale gray light that stretched thin across the trees, their branches bare and still, as if the forest itself were listening. And the walk to the clearing felt different now, not longer, not harder, but heavier, as though each step carried the weight of something he had not yet chosen to understand. And when they reached the moss-covered stone, Rex did not hesitate. He moved straight to it. and sat, just as he had the days before. But this time he did not simply stare. He lowered his head slightly, ears angled forward, body still, like he was tuning himself to something beneath the surface, something steady and patient. And Daniel stood there for a moment, hands resting at his sides, watching the dog, feeling that quiet pressure again, the kind that did not demand attention but refused to fade. And slowly, almost without thinking, he stepped closer and knelt beside the stone, brushing his gloved fingers across its surface, the moss damp and cold beneath his touch. And for a second, it was just that, a stone, worn and ordinary. But then he paused, his hand hovering just above it, because there was something else, something so faint he almost dismissed it, a subtle vibration, not a sound exactly, more like a presence felt through the skin, rhythmic in a way that stirred something old in his memory, something trained into him years ago when silence was never truly silent. And he pulled his hand back, his jaw tightening slightly as he exhaled, telling himself it was the ground settling, or water moving beneath the soil, anything simple enough to explain it away. But Rex shifted then, placing one paw gently against the edge of the stone, pressing down as if to show him, not forcefully, not urgently, just enough to say, "This is where you need to pay attention." And Daniel watched that small gesture, something about it cutting through the noise of his thoughts, and he let out a quiet breath before reaching down again, this time pressing his palm flat against the stone, holding it there longer, letting himself feel past the surface. And there it was again, faint but undeniable, a pulse, slow and measured, like a distant echo of something alive, repeating at intervals too precise to be random. And his brow furrowed as he counted without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 20, and then it came again, that same subtle tremor, and something in his chest tightened, not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that did not come with words, only a quiet certainty that this was not new, that he had felt something like this before, somewhere he did not often let himself revisit. And he drew his hand away, rubbing his fingers together as if to shake off the sensation, but it lingered, not in his skin, but deeper, and Rex let out a low, soft sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between, as if acknowledging that the connection had finally been made. And Daniel sat back on his heels, eyes fixed on the stone, the forest around them holding its stillness, the air unmoving, as if even the wind had chosen to wait. And for the first time since Rex had started returning here, Daniel did not call him away. He did not turn back toward the cabin or dismiss the moment as something small. Instead, he stayed, listening not with his ears, but with the part of him that had once learned to trust what could not be seen. And in that quiet, with the cold pressing in and the faint rhythm beneath the earth continuing its steady pattern, he realized something he could not ignore anymore. Whatever was beneath that stone had not just been waiting, it had been calling, and somehow, Rex had heard it long before he ever did. The rest of that day moved with a quiet tension that Daniel could not shake, as if the world around him had shifted just slightly out of place, not enough to see, but enough to feel in the spaces between moments. And even after they returned to the cabin, Rex did not settle the way he usually did, pacing slowly from door to window, pausing only to glance back at Daniel as though waiting for something more than routine to guide them. And Daniel tried to occupy himself with small tasks, stacking firewood, checking the old furnace, running his hands over familiar objects that once grounded him, but each action felt thinner than usual, like going through motions that no longer carried the same weight. And beneath it all, that rhythm lingered in his mind, steady and patient, a pattern that refused to fade. And by late afternoon, when the light began to soften and stretch long across the floorboards, he gave in to it, pulling on his coat again without speaking, and Rex was already at the door before he even reached for the handle, as if the decision had been made long before Daniel admitted it to himself. And the walk back to the clearing felt faster this time, not because the distance had changed, but because something inside him had shifted from avoidance to acceptance. And when they reached the stone, Rex did not sit immediately. Instead, he circled it once, nose low to the ground, tracing an invisible boundary, then stopped at the same spot as before and looked up at Daniel, waiting, and that look held no urgency, no fear, just a quiet certainty that this was where the truth rested. And Daniel stepped closer, kneeling again. But this time he did not hesitate. He brushed away the thin layer of frost and damp leaves gathered at the base of the stone, clearing a small edge where the soil met its surface. And as his glove scraped gently against the ground, he noticed something he had not seen before, a straight line, too clean, too deliberate to be natural, running along the lower edge of the stone. And his breath slowed as he followed it with his fingers, tracing the faint outline of what could only be a seam, subtle but precise, like something placed rather than formed. And he leaned in closer, his other hand pressing against the earth beside it, feeling again for that pulse. And it was there, unchanged, steady as before, but now it felt closer, more defined, as though the ground itself had grown thinner between him and whatever lay beneath. And Rex let out a soft sound behind him, a low breath that seemed to carry both patience and encouragement. And Daniel sat back slightly, his eyes fixed on the stone, the seam, the quiet geometry of something hidden in plain sight. And a memory surfaced then, not as a full picture, but as a feeling, the memory of sealed doors and buried structures, of things designed not to be found unless someone knew exactly where to look. And his jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly, the cold air sharpening his focus. And without speaking, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small folding knife he carried more out of habit than need, flipping it open with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. And carefully, deliberately, he pressed the tip into the edge of that seam, testing it, not forcing, just feeling for resistance. And for a moment, nothing happened, the stone holding its silence. But then there was a faint shift, almost imperceptible, a subtle give beneath the blade. And Daniel paused, his hand steady but his pulse beginning to rise, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that he had just crossed from guessing into truth. And Rex stepped closer, standing beside him now, his presence solid and unwavering. And as Daniel adjusted his grip and pressed again, the seam widened just enough to reveal something beneath. Not earth, not rock, but metal, smooth and cold, hidden just below the surface. And Daniel drew in a slow breath, his eyes narrowing slightly as the last of his doubt fell away, because whatever this was, it had not been placed here by accident, and whatever waited below had been waiting for a very long time. And as the light faded gently through the trees and the first shadows of evening stretched across the clearing, Daniel realized that this was no longer about curiosity. It was about a choice, to walk away and let the ground keep its secret, or to keep listening to what had already begun to reveal itself. And beside him, Rex did not move, as if he had already made that choice long ago. Daniel did not pull the blade away this time. Instead, he held it there, steady against the thin seam, as if the smallest movement might either reveal everything or seal it shut again. And the forest around him seemed to lean into the moment, the air growing still in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though even the wind had chosen not to interfere. And Rex remained at his side, close enough that Daniel could feel the quiet warmth of him through his coat, a steady presence that did not rush or retreat, only stayed. And that steadiness grounded him more than anything else could have, because whatever this was, whatever lay beneath that stone, it was no longer just a curiosity. It was something real, something constructed, something that had been hidden with intention. And Daniel shifted his position slightly, planting his boots more firmly into the cold earth as he pressed the knife again along the edge, widening the narrow gap just enough to slip his fingers into it. And the moment his glove brushed the metal beneath, a faint vibration traveled up his hand, stronger now, clearer, no longer something he could question or dismiss. It was there, steady and repeating, a pulse that felt too precise to belong to nature. And his breath slowed as his focus sharpened, instincts long buried beginning to rise quietly to the surface, not with urgency, but with familiarity. And he eased the blade back, sliding it along the seam with care, feeling for any shift, any weakness. And then it came, a soft release, barely audible, like a latch giving way after years of silence. And Daniel froze for a second, his hand hovering as the stone beneath his fingers shifted ever so slightly. Not lifting, not opening fully, but loosening, as if whatever held it in place had just been undone. And Rex's ears flicked forward at the same instant, his body still, alert but calm, as though he had expected this moment all along. And Daniel let out a slow breath, one he had not realized he was holding. Before placing both hands against the surface of the stone, testing its weight, and it was heavier than he expected, solid and grounded, but no longer fixed, and with a steady push, he felt it move, not easily, but enough to confirm what he already knew. This was not just a rock, it was a cover, and beneath it, something waited, something built, something sealed away from time. And as the stone shifted slightly to one side, a narrow line of darkness opened beneath it, revealing the edge of a metal surface below, smooth and worn, its color dulled by years but unmistakable in its purpose. And Daniel leaned closer, brushing away more of the dirt and debris that had gathered around it, uncovering the outline of what looked like a hatch, rectangular, deliberate, its edges defined with a precision that spoke of human design. And his pulse picked up, not from fear, but from the weight of realization, because he had seen structures like this before, not here, not in this forest, but in places where things were meant to be hidden, protected, or forgotten. And for a moment, he closed his eyes, the faint rhythm beneath his hands aligning with something deeper in his memory, something he had spent years trying to quiet. And when he opened them again, the clearing felt different, not just a place in the woods, but a threshold, a line between what had been known and what had been waiting. And Rex stepped forward then, lowering his head slightly toward the opening, not crossing it, not touching it, just acknowledging it, as if to say this was as far as he would lead. And the rest was Daniel's to face, and Daniel understood that without words, understood that whatever came next would not be guided by instinct alone, but by choice. And he rested his hand briefly on Rex's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life there, grounding himself in the present before looking back at the partially revealed hatch, the quiet dark space beneath it holding its silence, patient and unchanged. And in that stillness, Daniel realized something simple and undeniable. The world had not brought him here by accident, and whatever waited below had not called out loudly or forced itself into the light. It had simply waited, trusting that one day, someone would listen long enough to finally open the door. Daniel did not rush the next movement, because something about the space beneath that partially revealed hatch demanded patience, the kind that could not be forced without consequence. And he shifted the stone a few more inches to the side, just enough to expose the full outline of the metal surface below, brushing away the remaining dirt with slow, deliberate motions until the edges became clear, a rectangular hatch set firmly into the earth, its corners reinforced, its surface worn but intact. And at its center, just barely visible beneath years of grime, was a recessed handle, flat against the metal as if designed to remain unnoticed. And Daniel sat back for a moment, resting his weight on his heels as he studied it, his breath steady but deeper now, because the realization had settled fully into place. This had been built by someone who understood how to hide things not just physically, but from time itself. And beside him, Rex remained still, his gaze fixed on the hatch, not tense, not fearful, just present, as if the long wait had led to this exact moment, and nothing about it surprised him. And Daniel reached forward again, this time without hesitation, sliding his fingers into the narrow groove of the handle and pulling gently at first, testing the resistance. And the hatch did not give, not immediately, but there was a shift, subtle but real, the faintest movement beneath his grip that told him it had not been sealed shut forever, only left undisturbed. And he adjusted his position, planting one boot against the ground for leverage, and pulled again, this time with steady pressure, and slowly, with a low, quiet sound that seemed to echo more in feeling than in air. The hatch began to lift, the metal separating from the earth with a reluctance that spoke of years, maybe decades, of silence. And as it opened, a narrow breath of air escaped from below, cool and dry, carrying with it a faint scent that was not decay, not dampness, but something older, something preserved, like a space that had not been touched by weather or time. And Daniel paused, holding the hatch halfway open, letting that air rise and settle, his eyes adjusting to the darkness beneath. And at first, there was nothing to see, only shadow layered upon shadow. But then, as his vision steadied, shapes began to form, faint outlines of a narrow passage leading downward, metal steps descending into a space hidden from the world above. And his grip tightened slightly on the edge of the hatch, not from fear, but from the weight of what stood before him. Because this was no longer just a hidden object, it was an entry, a path, something meant to be used, and the steady rhythm he had felt before seemed clearer now, not louder, but closer, as if the source of it lay somewhere below those steps, waiting with the same quiet patience it had always held. And Rex shifted beside him, stepping closer to the edge but not crossing it, his body angled slightly forward, ears alert, yet he did not descend, did not urge Daniel onward. He simply stood there, as if acknowledging that his role had been to lead, not to follow. And Daniel understood that in a way that did not require words, understood that whatever lay below was something he had to face on his own, and he lowered the hatch fully, resting it open against the ground. And for a moment, he sat there in the fading light of the clearing, the forest around him still and silent, the entrance at his feet waiting without pressure, without demand, and he thought about turning back, about covering it again and walking away, letting the world remain as it had been before this moment. But the thought did not hold. It slipped away as quickly as it came, because something inside him had already crossed that threshold, already chosen to listen instead of ignore. And he placed one hand on the edge of the hatch, the other briefly resting against Rex's neck, grounding himself in that familiar presence before shifting forward, bringing himself closer to the opening, his gaze fixed on the narrow steps descending into the unknown. And in that quiet space between hesitation and action, he realized something simple and undeniable. Some doors do not open to be explored. They open because they are ready to be remembered. Daniel lowered himself slowly toward the opening, his boots finding the first metal step with a hollow, muted sound that seemed to disappear almost as soon as it was made, as if the space below absorbed noise rather than carried it. And he paused there, one hand still gripping the edge of the hatch above, his body half in the world he knew and half in the one he had just uncovered. And the air that rose from below was steady and cool, not cold like the surface outside, but constant, untouched by the shifting temperatures of day and night. And it carried that same faint, preserved scent he had noticed before, something clean yet old, like a place that had been sealed with intention rather than forgotten by accident. And behind him, Rex stood at the edge, watching, his silhouette framed by the fading light of the clearing, ears forward, eyes steady, not anxious, not urging, just present in a way that told Daniel he was not alone, even as he stepped into something unknown. And with a slow exhale, Daniel released his grip on the hatch and let his other foot follow, descending one step at a time, careful and measured, each movement guided by instinct rather than urgency. And as he moved deeper, the light from above narrowed into a thin, pale line that stretched down the walls before fading into shadow. And Daniel reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small flashlight, the kind he carried out of habit more than expectation. And when he clicked it on, the beam cut cleanly through the darkness, revealing metal walls on either side, smooth and reinforced, marked faintly by time but still intact, and the steps beneath him continued downward for what felt like more than a few feet, leading into a space that was larger than he had expected. And as he reached the bottom, his boots touched a solid floor, the sound echoing softly now, not hollow, but contained, as if the room itself held the noise close. And he lifted the light, sweeping it slowly across the interior, and what he saw was not decay, not ruin, but order, a narrow chamber lined with shelves and equipment, everything coated in a thin layer of dust but otherwise preserved, tools neatly arranged, crates stacked with care, and along one wall, a row of old instruments, their dials frozen in place, their surfaces dulled but recognizable. And Daniel's breath slowed as he took it in, because this was not just a shelter, not just a hidden space. It was a place built with purpose, maintained with discipline, and left behind without chaos. And the steady rhythm he had felt above was stronger here, not louder, but more present, a pulse that seemed to travel through the very structure. And he turned his head slightly, listening, not with his ears alone, but with the part of him that had learned to read patterns beneath silence. And his gaze settled on the far end of the chamber, where a single object stood apart from the rest, a metal console, its surface darker, more worn, as if it had been touched more often than anything else in the room. And at its center, a small panel, faintly illuminated by a soft, intermittent glow, barely visible but unmistakable, and Daniel felt something shift inside him then. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition. The kind that did not come from seeing something new, but from remembering something he had once known and tried to forget. And he took a slow step forward, the beam of his flashlight steady in his hand, the quiet pulse guiding him without sound. And behind him, above the narrow opening, Rex remained at the edge, watching the space below, not entering, not retreating, simply holding his place, as if he understood that some paths were meant to be walked alone, but never truly without witness. And as Daniel approached the console, the faint light pulsed once more, steady and patient, and in that moment he realized something that settled deep within him. Whatever this place had been, whatever it was meant for, it had not stopped waiting, and somehow, against all odds, it had been waiting for him. Daniel slowed as he approached the console, each step measured not by distance, but by the quiet pull of something deeper than curiosity. The soft, intermittent glow from the panel casting a faint rhythm against the metal surface, pulsing in the same steady interval he had felt through the ground above. And as he drew closer, the details began to sharpen beneath the beam of his flashlight, revealing a series of worn dials, labeled switches, and a narrow speaker grill set into the upper corner, all aged but intact, as if time had chosen to pass around this place rather than through it. And Daniel stopped just short of the console, his breath steady, his gaze fixed on that small source of light, watching it pulse once, then again, the interval precise, familiar in a way that stirred something buried deep in his memory. And without thinking, he counted again, silently, the seconds stretching between each flicker. And when the next pulse came exactly as expected, something inside him settled into place, not with comfort, but with recognition. And he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of that realization took hold. Because this was not random, not natural, it was deliberate, structured, a signal that had been repeating long before he ever stepped into this forest. And for a moment, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the understanding that whatever came next would not be unknown in the way he had first believed. It would be something remembered, something he had once known how to read. And he reached out, his gloved hand hovering just above the surface of the console, before finally resting against it, the metal cool and still beneath his touch. And as his fingers traced along the edge of the panel, brushing lightly over the worn markings, a faint sound broke the silence, so soft he almost missed it, a low crackle from the speaker, like the first breath of a voice trying to find its way back. And Daniel froze, his hands still, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened, the sound fading as quickly as it came, leaving only the steady pulse behind. But it was enough to confirm what his instincts had already begun to accept. And he leaned in closer, bringing the flashlight beam directly over the panel, illuminating a small sequence of etched characters beside the controls, faded but still legible. And as his eyes moved across them, his breath caught for just a fraction of a second, because the markings were not foreign, not strange, they were familiar, unmistakably so, the kind of coded labeling used in field equipment he had not seen in years. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around him, the present folding slightly into the past, the quiet hum of the chamber aligning with echoes of a different time. Different places where silence had carried meaning and patterns had been the difference between knowing and missing something vital. And Daniel drew his hand back slowly, his jaw tightening as he let the memory settle without pushing it away, because this was no longer something he could ignore or explain away. It was something connected, not just to the world beneath his feet, but to the life he had tried to leave behind. And behind him, above the narrow opening, Rex shifted slightly, a soft movement that carried down into the chamber, grounding Daniel in the present once more. And he glanced back briefly, catching a glimpse of the dog's steady outline against the fading light, a reminder that he was not lost in what had been, that he was here, now, with a choice still in front of him. And he turned back to the console, his focus steadying, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached again, toward the panel, this time not just to observe, but to understand, his fingers hovering over the controls as the faint glow pulsed once more beneath them, steady and patient. And in that quiet moment, Daniel realized something that settled deeper than thought. Some signals are not meant to be discovered quickly. they are meant to endure, repeating themselves until the right person finally listens long enough to recognize the truth they carry. Daniel did not press anything at first, because something about the console demanded more than reaction. It demanded understanding, and he stood there with his hand hovering just inches above the controls, watching the faint pulse continue its steady rhythm, the soft glow rising and falling like a quiet breath that had never stopped. And he let himself listen again, not just to the sound, but to the pattern beneath it, the spacing, the consistency, the intention woven into each interval. And slowly, almost without realizing it, his mind began to align with it, the way it once had years ago when patterns were not just signals but lifelines. And he closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the rhythm settle into something recognizable, something structured. And when he opened them again, there was a shift in his expression, subtle but real, because what he was seeing was no longer random. It was a sequence, a code, and his breath deepened as he leaned slightly closer to the panel, his fingers moving carefully across the surface until they found a small recessed switch near the base, worn smooth from use, positioned with intention rather than convenience. And he paused again, not from hesitation, but from respect for what that single movement might unlock. And above him, through the narrow opening, a faint sound drifted down, the soft movement of Rex adjusting his stance, a quiet reminder of presence, of grounding. And Daniel let that steady him before finally pressing the switch, not forcefully, not abruptly, just enough to engage it. And for a moment, nothing changed. The pulse continued, the silence remained, and then, gradually, the console responded, not with a sudden burst of activity, but with a slow awakening, a deeper hum rising beneath the surface, the faint glow strengthening slightly, as if something long dormant had recognized the touch. And the speaker crackled again, this time lingering longer, the sound uneven at first, like a voice finding its way through layers of distance and time. And Daniel remained still, his focus unwavering, as fragments of sound began to form, not clear words yet, but structured enough to confirm that this was not just a machine, it was a message. And his chest tightened slightly as he listened, because there was a familiarity in the cadence, something about the way the signal carried itself that reached into memory without asking permission. And he adjusted the flashlight, angling it to better illuminate the panel, his eyes scanning for anything that might help him interpret what he was hearing. And there, just beneath the speaker, he noticed a small etched line of text, worn but still present. And as he leaned closer, the letters came into focus, faint but unmistakable, and something in him stilled completely, because the marking was not generic, not anonymous. It was specific, tied to a unit designation he had not seen in years, one that existed not just in records, but in the quiet, unspoken parts of his past. And his hand lowered slightly from the controls as that realization settled in, not as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation of something deeper than coincidence. And the sound from the speaker shifted again, the crackle, smoothing just enough for a pattern to emerge, a sequence of tones and pauses that aligned perfectly with the pulse he had felt from the beginning. And Daniel's lips parted slightly as he recognized it fully now, not just as a signal, but as communication, deliberate and precise, repeating itself with the patience of something that had never given up on being heard. And he stood there, listening, not interrupting, not rushing to respond, because for the first time since he had uncovered the hatch, he understood that this was not just about discovery, it was about connection, something reaching forward through time, waiting for someone who could understand what it was trying to say. And above him, the fading light from the forest stretched thin across the opening, the world outside continuing quietly as it always had, unaware of the moment unfolding beneath it. And in that hidden chamber, with the soft pulse of the console and the steady presence of Rex above, Daniel realized something that settled deeply into him. Some messages are not lost. They are simply waiting for the right silence to be heard. Daniel did not speak as the signal continued, because there was nothing to say that would not interrupt what had already begun to reveal itself. And he stood there with his hand resting lightly against the console, listening as the pattern repeated again and again, each tone and pause forming a structure that his mind no longer had to chase, only recognize. And slowly, quietly, the meaning began to settle into place, not as a sudden realization, but but as something unfolding piece by piece. The way memories return when they are finally given space, and his eyes lowered slightly to the panel beneath the speaker, tracing the faint markings again, the unit designation, the subtle alignment of symbols that had once guided him through situations where clarity came only from patience. And now, standing in this hidden chamber, he understood that the signal was not just active, it was intentional, repeating a message that had been left behind with care. And as he listened more closely, the distortion began to thin just enough for fragments of sound to take shape, not full sentences, but tones that carried weight, that carried direction. And Daniel adjusted his stance, leaning slightly closer, his focus narrowing until the rest of the room faded into the background. And in that stillness, the pattern shifted just enough for him to hear it, not as noise, but as meaning, a simple sequence, repeated with quiet persistence, coordinates, not spoken, but encoded, a location marked with precision, and his breath caught slightly as he recognized the structure, the familiar cadence of numbers translated through tone, and he straightened slowly, the realization settling deeper than surprise, because this was not random, not abandoned. It was a message meant to guide, to point somewhere beyond this place. And for a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the sequence repeat once more, committing it to memory the way he had been trained to do, not with urgency, but with certainty. And when he opened them again, the room felt different, not just a hidden space beneath the earth, but a starting point, something left behind not to be discovered for its own sake, but to lead forward. And he stepped back from the console, his hand dropping to his side as the steady pulse continued, unchanged, as if it no longer needed his attention to exist. And he turned toward the narrow steps, the faint light from above now dimmer as evening settled fully over the forest. And as he moved toward the exit, the quiet hum of the chamber remained behind him, steady and patient, not ending, not fading, simply continuing as it always had. And when he reached the top, he paused at the edge of the opening, looking up at the silhouette of Rex waiting there, unmoving, unwavering. And for a moment, Daniel simply stood there, the weight of what he had found resting not as a burden, but as something quieter, something that felt almost like purpose. And he climbed out slowly, the cold evening air meeting him as he stepped back into the clearing, the world above unchanged, the trees still, the sky dimming into shades of blue and gray. And Rex stepped forward immediately, pressing close to his side, his presence solid and familiar. And Daniel rested a hand briefly on his neck, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement, because without him, none of this would have been uncovered, none of it would have been heard. And together they stood there for a moment, the open hatch behind them, the forest, stretching out ahead, and Daniel lifted his gaze toward the distance, toward a place he could not yet see but now knew existed, marked somewhere beyond the trees by a signal that had waited long enough to be followed. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady in the cooling air, as a quiet understanding settled into him. He had not come here searching for anything, not answers, not meaning, not even peace, but somehow, through patience and loyalty, something had found him instead, something that had been waiting not for noise, not for force, but for someone willing to listen long enough to finally understand where the path was meant to begin.